take a little tiny bit of a break and grab some food when they do get here. Thanks everybody and welcome to another Brown Bag Research Lunch. Our department head, Peter Wilcock, is going to introduce today's speaker.
He's only your head, but
My department head, and Ed's.
Do I have to stand up?
You can do whatever you please.
Well, hi, folks. This is Edd Hammill. Ed has joined the faculty August 1st of this year. One of two new hires in ecology, and Ed works on more ecological topics than I can really figure out, but he's focusing a lot on conservation biology and spatial modeling and things like that. And there's lots of other things I could tell you about him, but we'll save them for next time.
This is on the screen. Okay. We're good? Yeah. My name is Jon. I'm your Quinney. Go on, technology.
You should just choose the squirrel one.
Yeah, the squirrel one. There we are. We're up there. Now we've cut off half the presentation. Now the squirrel's back.
Oh, that's good.
That might be the way to go, actually. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the technology as well. Thanks for the invite. Yeah, my name's Edd Hammill. I've recently started up at USU. Probably within the last few months. And today I'm going to talk to you about two areas of my research, looking at what we call systematic spatial planning at the landscape scale, and I'm going to illustrate this whole concept with two examples that we've recently been conducting, looking at warfare ecology and transport planning. Bit of transparency early on, I didn't take this picture. This is taken by a friend of mine who's a journalist, and it's a pair of Kurdish fighters, and I thought it was possibly the most culturally sensitive picture I could put up to illustrate warfare. About me generally, this is a kind of a new part of my research. The vast majority of my career up until a couple of years ago, I was actually a population community ecologist working out in the field, specifically in Costa Rica and in the tropics. And I thought this picture illustrated it really well because it's the classic field biologist with field shirt, terrible hair, mud-splattered ATV, and pulling a highly venomous snake out of a plant with a small pair of tweezers. This is how I spent the majority of my life, and I enjoyed it. And I still do a fair bit of work on this, a couple of papers just recently looking at this. But the whole time I was doing this sort of blue sky conceptual research, I had this sort of almost nagging feeling in the back of my head about what am I actually doing that's of any benefit to society? How am I helping the world? Like, can I justify my own existence myself? And this sort of started a new kind of thinking for me about, well, I do all this research, but how is this actually used? And if we think about like conceptual blue sky research, the way it tends to start out is we observe the standard scientific method, so we see something beautiful happening in the field, we come up with a hypothesis as to why that's happening, we then have an incredibly sort of rigorous double-blind experiment to collect highly precise data to investigate our process. We then subject this to an absolute battery of incredibly complicated analytical tests, and those guide us towards our results. So we follow this incredibly precise pattern, and we end up with our results. What then actually happens? Well, and a lot of the time, if it's blue sky research, nothing at all. It's of no interest to the public, unfortunately. Sometimes it does get picked up, and at that point, the results that you spent ages looking at get given as a debate point to somebody who might not be fully aware of the situation. So we end up carrying out all of this research, and at the end of it, it gets passed on to someone with occasionally a very poor grasp of the facts, and they use it as a talking point in the debate. This was really hammered home to me when I worked for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada, where we conducted this huge experiment spanning about 3 years, looking at what was causing the declines in rates of migrating sockeye salmon. We conducted this huge experiment, and we showed that there's a genetic signature present in the salmon that is associated with a new retrovirus, and this was also causing declines in the number of fish that could migrate back up the river. This project took about 3 to 5 years. It required multiple surveys into the open ocean. It required a huge load of people and a massive genomic array. The results from it were then used as one piece of evidence in a judicial inquiry called the Cohen Commission, where it was just another talking point. So all that effort just went into, we think it might be this, we think it might be that. And this started to get me thinking about this idea of what we call systematic decision making. So what the idea is, or what if we take the same attitude towards using data as we take towards analysing them? So rather than just coming up with analysing your data and saying what's going on, can we actually then use that to guide decisions rather than just looking at facts and figures? And this is part of what we call, and the part of this that I'm specifically looking at, is what we call systematic spatial planning and decision making. And so what this is doing is it's taking a quantitative approach to how you use data at the end. And this quantitative approach, it utilises an awful lot of computing power to inform actual decisions at a landscape scale. So rather than relying on expert opinion about where we should do certain things, you just chuck an awful lot of data at a computer and it actually guides the management strategies you should take. We found generally this increases an awful lot of transparency, because what you can do in some cases is actually give the computer program and the data to a third party, and then them run the analyses, and then they end up with the exact same results as you, and that then demonstrates, okay, this isn't due to our personal biases. In addition, the magic words, a lot of the time, it does lend to reducing costs in terms of management actions. And we actually have specific software tools available now to do this sort of systematic planning. One of the ones that's incredibly established around the world is a software package called MarkSan. It's a small, free software package operated out of the University of Queensland. Anyone can download it. It's got a bit of a steep learning curve, but what MarkSan does is it identifies new areas for conservation or priority locations to concentrate management actions. MarkSan has had a hell of a lot of really big, notable successes. Its big flagship is this was the piece of software that was used to determine the layout of Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, which is the largest marine park in the world. It's been used in a load of terrestrial and marine applications. It's so successful that currently 10% of the surface of the planet has its use determined by this one small piece of software. As well as MarkSan, we're currently in the process of developing a new piece of software called Marlin, which rather than identifying areas for conservation across a landscape, it actually informs decisions regarding route planning. So where do you set up linear infrastructure? Where do you put railway lines? Where do you put roads? And where do you put pipelines? So we have these two pieces of software. MarkSan is highly established and is used to identify new protected areas. Marlin is still currently in development and is generally route planning for linear infrastructure. What I'd now like to do is talk about two projects that I've been recently carrying out that illustrate the utility of this approach of systematic spatial planning and the outcome that actually came up. And what I'm going to talk about is this idea of using MarkSan to identify novel protected areas in regions experiencing extreme military conflict. And then Marlin, we're talking about ways of designing mining infrastructure. So what MarkSan does, this small piece of software, at the end of the day, is all it does is identify new areas to include in a protected area network or places that you want to concentrate management efforts. The design and management of protected area networks is still the heart of conservation all over the world. According to the World Bank, about 14% of the surface of the terrestrial surface of the planet is now in a protected area, but an awful lot of people who are far smarter and more experienced than me have shown that this is actually quite inadequate, meaning that a lot of species, a lot of ecoregions are massively underprotected. And so what MarkSan is charged with doing is saying, where do we put new protected areas? Where do we invest? And then MarkSan has got a little bit of a problem with it historically, and that is when MarkSan finds a new protected area, it says that protected area is now safe. Whatever goes on, whatever species existed in that, can now exist unmolested in perpetuity. Any ecosystem process that was going on in that area will now go on forever. And that's not always the case. Protected areas can get undermined an awful lot, and it can be done in multiple different routes. The one I'm going to focus on today is military conflict. Although it might sound a bit strange to talk about military conflict and protected areas in the United States, internationally this is actually quite a big problem, because when we're looking at making new protected areas, we want to go to highly biodiverse regions. Unfortunately, about 90% of the armed conflicts that occurred between 1950 and 2000 occurred in biodiversity hotspots. So anywhere that's nice and got loads of animals and plants and is pristine is also a great place to hold a small guerrilla war. So how do we then go about selecting new protected areas when we've got these big conflict-prone regions. And this is not an abstract concept. So one of the big examples of when this has actually happened historically quite badly is Rwanda. So Rwanda, a small Central African country, it experienced a horrendous genocide in the 90s. There was obviously pretty bad news, but what happened at the same time is the Akagera National Park, the biggest national park in Rwanda, actually shrank to about 30% of its original size during that genocide because people were kind of busy. So how do we then go about looking at increasing our protected areas when we've got these sort of problems going on? Well, we set about starting up where we can have 4 different attitudes to the risk of conflict that can then be incorporated into how we make decisions about where to set up protected areas. And these 4 different attitudes towards risk represent 4 different strategies for targeting investment. First thing you can do is you just ignore the fact there's a chance of conflict risk. You ignore the fact that when you set up a new protected area, it's going to be fine, nothing's going to happen. We call that conflict ignorant strategy. Secondly, you might set a maximum tolerable threshold of risk where you just say, right, anywhere with a greater than 50% chance of risk, it's far too dangerous, we're not going anywhere near it, that place is excluded from inclusion in a protected area. You might thirdly, explicitly account for the risk of conflict. And this is when what you do is across your landscape, you have an estimate of the risk of every area being lost. You account for that, and then you can either purchase other areas elsewhere to mitigate against the fact that something will be lost, or you just avoid that's the area. Finally, you can combine attitudes 2 and 3, and what you do is you say, right, we're going to avoid any area with a conflict risk greater than this level. At the same time, we will account for the risk in the remainder, so it's a combination of these 2. Okay. So what we did, if you're going to do this, you might as well do it big. We set about, with a group of us in Australia, identifying new protected areas for all of continental Africa and Madagascar. At the minute, Africa has about 2.2 square kilometres, 2.2 million square kilometres in protected areas. However, this is massively inadequate because more than 20% of its mammals have less than 5% of their range in a protected area. Africa, unfortunately, has the lowest continental peace score. It's the most unstable continent in the world. It has an awful lot of problems in an awful lot of places. This is a score that is identified by a group out of Holland called the Institute for Economics and Peace. So, what I did the first stop is solicit 2 estimates of conflict risk. This is a national scale estimate of conflict risk. So in this case, every single country is just assigned a national scale level of risk, and that risk is exactly the same over the whole nation. This estimate is produced by the Institute for Economics and Peace. It's based on 27 different metrics encountering all sorts of measures of stability, and it's put together by a big group of experts that really know what they're doing. The problem with this is, within every nation, there is no spatial heterogeneity in risk. So for example, this is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, one of the most unstable countries in the world. In this risk estimate, you can see the risk of anything going wrong is exactly the same across the entire nation. That nation is bigger than France and Belgium combined. So as a result, it's quite a big place. So this is produced by a load of experts that really know what they're doing, but it hasn't got a lot of spatial precision. So I set about building my own fine-scale risk estimate. In this case, rather than applying a national estimate, every single 10 by 10 kilometre grid cell gets its own unique estimate of conflict risk based upon the history of conflict that's taken place, when the last conflict happened, and how many people were killed. So it gives an indication of the likelihood and also the impact. And what we can see from this is that, first of all, we have these pockets of absolutely intense conflict risk, but within nations we get a lot of heterogeneity. So for example, in the national estimate, Democratic Republic of Congo is the most dangerous country in the world. However, the vast majority of those incidents are concentrated on this eastern border with Rwanda and Uganda. This is where Joseph Kony hangs out, like the film went viral a few years ago. However, this area is all super safe. Well, safer. What we did find at the same time, rather unfortunately, is this earlier described correlation between areas of high biodiversity and high conflict risk. This is an indication of mammal diversity. The most diverse area is right in the most dangerous area. We have the same problem with the Niger Delta, it's getting nasty. Equatorial Guinea is kind of nasty. And this is actually the beginning of the Arab Spring. But as well, you can see this correlation again. So the data that I used to start doing this analysis was, first things we did was get our conservation features. What is it we actually want to protect? So I went and got the distribution of Africa's 121 unique ecoregions and the ranges of 236 endangered mammals. So we have about 350 different conservation features. We then set a target of, say, I want to conserve 30% of every single feature. The reason we picked 30% is there's a great paper by Betts and Villard that shows, in the absence of any other information, if you conserve 30% of the current distribution of a species, there's a 95% chance that species will survive for the next 100 years. So if you don't know anything else, it's a great place to start. We then calculated land costs in terms of purchasing the land and then managing the land for a 5-year management period. And then also I assigned a risk of conflict for every single planning unit. This is the data we put together. And what we did then is then use this software package MarkSan to actually guide and where should we put new protected areas. Just go through briefly how MarkSan works. All it does is you take your area that you're interested in, and MarkSan then just throws a grid cell over the entire region. This is a cartoon. In reality, there were 336,000 different planning units, as we call them, and each one was 10 by 10 square kilometres. Each one of those planning units, you then assign it data based on the area of that planning unit covered by every conservation feature, the cost of purchasing and managing that planning unit, and then in my case, the conflict risk as well. The way that works is, a nice little cartoon like this is a very simplified diagram. Each one of these represents a planning unit. These sort of polygons represent distributions of a bunch of different species. So you say to MarkSan, buy me the cells that cost the least amount of money that conserves 30% of each one of these different species. MarkSan will then say, okay, pick this bunch of cells here, purchase those, everything's conserved enough. That's how MarkSan tends to work. But in our case, we've got this problem where we might lose cells due to conflict. So how do we go about this? Well, what we do is, first of all, we add in the conflict risk estimate for every single cell that we had before. We then run a load of mathematical simulations to guess how many of those will be lost and build a distribution. The way that you do that, you just simply add a random number between 1 and 100 to every single cell. If that random number is less than the risk of conflict, that cell has been lost. So what we see in this case is that we've got these 3 numbers that are less than the risk. As a result, those cells are lost. The remaining planning units are used to evaluate the performance of the overall network in terms of conservation targets met, cost, and return on investment. If you do this 1,000 times, you get a beautiful distribution. So what actually happened? Well, first of all, we'll look at the number of conservation targets met for each of our different attitudes towards risk. On these graphs, on the x-axis, we have the maximum tolerable risk threshold. That is only applied to a conflict avoiding and a conflict sensitive strategy. Those were the 2 cases in which we set an upper limit and we can't go anywhere past that. This is an indication of that limit being increased. And on the y-axis, we've got the number of targets met. What you see first of all is a conflict ignorance strategy, where you just ignore the risk, performs very badly in terms of number of targets met. This is because you're basing your purchasing decisions alone on cost and biodiversity, which means that you're often picking them in very dangerous areas and they're getting lost. When you look at a conflict avoiding strategy, which is when you just set a maximum threshold, you see that again it performs pretty badly in terms of number of targets. This is because at low thresholds there's just hardly anywhere available to purchase. At high thresholds it's behaving just the same as conflict ignorant. Conflict accounting, if you remember, that was the point at which we start to incorporate this risk into our purchasing decisions and buy extra land to mitigate against it, actually saved about double the number of targets that a conflict ignorant strategy would do. Conflict sensitive, at very low threshold, starts low and then builds up and eventually starts to behave just like conflict accounting. So we can see the benefit in terms of number of targets met just by accounting for this conflict and putting it into decisions. That's with the national scale risk estimate. If you use my fine scale, you see pretty much the same pattern, but crucially, conflict accounting and conflict sensitive conserve slightly more species. It's not a big jump, but it is significant. If you then look at costs, the conflict ignorant strategy has got very low costs. That's because you're purchasing just the absolute bare minimum number of planning units to get things started. Conflict avoiding A low threshold is very low because there's nowhere available to purchase. It then goes up and eventually meets a conflict ignorant. Conflict accounting actually costs about 50% more than a conflict ignorant strategy. That's because we're having to buy these extra lands to mitigate against losses. Conflict sensitive starts out low and then eventually starts to behave just like conflict accounting. If we look at it on the fine scale risk estimate, we see the same pattern, but crucially, the conflict accounting and conflict sensitive costs are considerably lower. If we translate that into actual returns on investment, we see that the conflict ignorant strategy actually had a very low return on investment in terms of number of targets met per billion. This is because although it had a low cost, you're losing an awful lot more, a lot of the targets to conflict. Conflict accounting has a much, much higher return on investment. This is because although it cost 50% more to sell the reserve network, it actually ends up saving 100% more targets, so it increases your return on investment. Conflict sensitive started out low and eventually meets up with conflict accounting. This is with that national scale risk estimate with no spatial heterogeneity within a nation. If you instead use the fine scale risk estimate, you see a slightly different change in the pattern. Again, conflict ignorant and conflict avoiding perform very badly. Conflict accounting performs very well and actually significantly better than under a national scale estimate. But crucially, your conflict sensitive starts very low when you have a low maximum threshold of risk, then accelerates rapidly, and between these 2 points is actually yielding a better return on investment than the conflict accounting strategy. The reason for that is that in this case, any ecosystem or any species that exists only in a dangerous area is essentially being triaged. You're not saving it. So you're not saving as many targets, but you're essentially saying anything that exists, anything dangerous, you're just not going in. So you're saving fewer targets, but you're getting a better return on investment. So in terms of the results summary, what we found is this idea of being ignorant towards risk or just trying to avoid it, those two strategies always perform badly. For both our conflict accounting and conflict sensitive strategy, a fine scale risk estimate actually outperforms a national scale. And what we found interesting is the highest return on investment overall is seen in the conflict sensitive strategy when the maximum risk is set between 30 and 45 and we use a fine scale risk estimate. However, the most targets were met in a conflict accounting strategy using a fine scale risk estimate. What this means is, depending on what your initial outcomes are, it's going to determine a little bit what strategy you adopt. If, for example, your goal is just to protect the most number of species, you would say, okay, I've got to accept a lot of risk and I'll adopt a conflict accounting strategy. If my goal is to get the highest return on investment, there are some areas that just weren't worth me investing in, then I'd adopt a conflict sensitive strategy and set a maximum threshold I'm willing to take in. In terms of management recommendations, the first thing we can say about this is, well, do not base any sort of international spending on national conflict risk levels. What you really should do is at a local scale solicit accurate fine-scale conflict risk estimates. And when you're doing this as well, it might be worth at some point considering the safety of conservation workers. That has been an issue in a few places. So this is great, but how does it really apply to Utah? Well, one of the things we wanted to try and do is look at, hey, can we take these exact same concepts and principles that we did looking at terrestrial animals in Africa and apply it to river protection here in Utah? And the basic goal is, how do you then allocate resources across a landscape when you have this mixture of risk, species distributions, and cost? So what we looked at doing is, well, there's an awful lot of potential risks to Utah, or to water in Utah, that probably aren't quantifiable. Just a couple of weeks ago, myself, Tricia Atwood and Jeremy Gator went up to look at a Diamond Fork restoration project, and within that watershed there's been an accidental discharge of an awful lot of sulphur into the river. That is something that we could potentially quantify, these sort of risks of contamination. In addition, when we're looking at increased development, that's going to have an awful lot of impact on watersheds, both in terms of it might actually encroach into watersheds, and also an increased population is going to increase the demand for water, so how's that going to affect it as well? Also, with the way the climate's going, we might end up moving from a landscape based on snow to one with a lot where rain is much more of an impact, and that's going to change how water is distributed through time. So these are all potential risks that we can potentially quantify. So what we can then do is do a little bit of an adjustment to the basic approach I did before, where rather than overlaying a grid across Utah and calling each one of those a planning unit, because that's not how watersheds behave, instead we use every single watershed as a planning unit itself. And we just then parameterize that watershed with the species that are present within it, how much it costs to manage, and also an estimate of the risk that that watershed is experiencing. We can then use those data in exactly the same way as we did looking at Africa to identify priority watersheds for conservation. And so we can get things like this when they're just told, okay, these two places have got the right balance of risk, cost, and species distributions. So the whole thing has an awful lot of parallels with warfare ecology. Our large terrestrial mammals are now stoneflies, and our military actors are now things like, well, mining and development. And so we just combine all this to identify priority areas. So essentially what I want you to take away from this is that a giraffe is a stonefly. So I talked here about how you cope in a landscape that's experiencing risk. How can we incorporate a risk across a landscape scale into decisions we might want to make? And this is good, but it's almost like a reactive attitude. It's like saying, how do we cope with things that are outside our control? And so then we started to think, well, in addition to just identifying protected areas, can we also just mitigate risks? Can we use some of the principles that we've had for these software packages to instead change the landscape so that they don't experience risk in the first place?
Ed, would that be a good spot just to let people grab a
Absolutely,
sandwich?
yeah. So if people want to go
If
and
you
tuck
want
in,
to quickly grab a sandwich, this might be just a good
Yeah.
time for it.
that's about the halfway stage.